is the Banner Baseball Show. Paul Mancano live on a Thursday in July. We are less than a week away from the MLB trade deadline as things are going to be heating up very quickly over the coming days. The Orioles seem to be playing their worst baseball as they stumble towards the trade deadline. Their offense has looked lackluster, and perhaps the Orioles might look to acquire a bat, but most likely they're going to be looking for pitching at this trade deadline. And on this show, I'm going to be joined by John Meoli, by Danielle Allentuck, and by Kyle Goon to go through several trade proposals that we think Mike Elias should consider as we get closer to the trade deadline. But first, let's touch on a report that I saw from Jeff Passan of ESPN, and it was added to by Ken Rosenthal of The Athletic today, that the Orioles could be considering a trade of one of their veterans. Ryan Mountcastle and Cedric Mullins were specifically mentioned by Jeff Passan. And then today, Ken Rosenthal of The Athletic mentioned Mountcastle as the most likely of the Orioles veterans to be dealt. Here's why I think that could happen. I'm not going to entirely rule it out. I think there's a world where this makes sense. If one of these two guys, Mountcastle or Mullins, is the final piece that is required to get a capital A ace in the vein of Tarek Skubal, and there really are only a handful of those guys around Major League Baseball, and even fewer of those guys are available via trade. But let's say there is one. Let's say it's Skubal or it's somebody else, and Mountcastle or Mullins is the final piece required to get a deal done. I think the Orioles would consider it because you do whatever you can to get an ace. And if that guy can pitch game 1, game 2, game 3, most likely not game 1 because Corbin Burns is going to be starting game 1, but can pitch in the playoffs and can be under team control for beyond 2024, I think the Orioles have to consider trading one of their veterans. They have the farm system they need to replace a bat in the lineup. We know Coby Mayo is awfully close to the big leagues. We know that Ramon Urias and Anthony Santander can play first base if Mountcastle is the one that is traded. And that would clear room for somebody maybe like Coby Mayo to come up or Kyle Stowers to come back up and play the outfield. But I think it's unlikely that the Orioles deal one of their veterans, specifically Mountcastle and Mullins. And I'll start with Mullins. He's turned his season around. For all of the poor play he put up in the first several months of the season, he's hitting .297 with an .832 OPS since June 12th. His last month plus of baseball has been very good. He still brings plus defense to center field. I know there's some overlap in skill set between him and Colton Cowser, but at this point, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to deal a guy who is under team control through 2025 if you don't have to. The other option, the other thing to consider here is that both of these guys, Mountcastle and Mullins, and specifically Mountcastle, are very valuable to this current team. I mean, Mountcastle is 7th on the Orioles in WAR with 1.8, according to Baseball Reference. He is 6th on the team in home runs. He brings plus defense to first base. There's just no guarantee that Coby Mayo, as a rookie, as a 22-year-old, is going to come up and immediately make the kind of impact that Ryan Mountcastle is giving you on a night in and night out basis. Coby Mayo is somebody who can bring a lot of power to this lineup in the future. But at 22 years old, we've seen rookies come up and struggle, specifically with the Orioles. We saw Jackson Holliday come up and struggle earlier this season. People forget that Adley Rutschman, when he first came up, went 6 weeks without recording an RBI, and some were calling for him to be sent back down. At the start of the 2022 season, or 2023 season, I should say, Gunnar Henderson was struggling mightily for the first month and a half of baseball. Coby Mayo could get the call up at the beginning of August if a trade for Mountcastle goes down, and he could struggle out of the gate. And for an offense that right now, after the first 2 games that they've put up in Miami, could use an influx of power, that might not be the kind of situation you want to throw a rookie like Coby Mayo in. And more importantly, both Ryan Mountcastle and Cedric Mullins are huge, huge pieces to this Orioles clubhouse. Would the Orioles want to risk breaking up the gang and breaking up a group that has been immensely successful, playing for each other, clearly enjoys each other's company, and clearly enjoys encouraging each other? Would the Orioles really want to do that in order to get a starting pitcher? I think the Orioles would be very, very hesitant to try to break up the good vibes that they have built over the last several years. And trading somebody like Ryan Mountcastle or Cedric Mullins in the midst of a playoff run where all of these guys are fighting for each other for the final 2 months of the season, that could send a poor message to your clubhouse. This isn't like the deal where the Orioles sent Trey Mancini at the trade deadline to the Houston Astros 2 years ago. That was a team that was almost definitely not going to make the playoffs. And Trey Mancini was a valuable veteran on that team, but the Orioles knew that they had to get something for him before he hit free agency. Neither Cedric Mullins nor Ryan Mountcastle is scheduled to hit free agency until at least after the 2025 season. So there's no rush to deal either of these guys. They're both positive war players on this team. And that's why I don't think it's likely that Cedric Mullins or Ryan Mountcastle could be dealt. But I do have several trade proposals for you today. I'm going to get to Kyle Goon and Danielle Allentuck and John Meoli in just a bit. But first and foremost, if you go to the BaltimoreBanner.com, where you can subscribe $1 for 6 months, we have 4 trade proposals that we think the Orioles should consider. And we each have the Orioles acquiring a different player. I have the Orioles trading for Cubs starting pitcher Jameson Taillon. He's 32 years old. He's a right-hander. He is on the second year of a 4-year, $68 million deal. And in exchange, I have the Orioles trading pitching prospect Seth Johnson and outfield prospect Judd Fabian. And the reason I think this deal might make sense is that Cubs president of baseball operations, Jed Hoyer, just came out and essentially waved the white flag, said that the Cubs are going to be looking at moves at this trade deadline that can impact winning clubs in 2025 and beyond. That means everybody's on the table. That means that Jameson Taillon, who has been one of the better pitchers in the National League this year, is certainly on the table. A 3.10 ERA in 93 innings. He is a workhorse on the mound and has really bounced back from a poor 2023 season, his first season with Chicago, and is doing good things for them. He's not an ace, but he can start a playoff game. And he's under team control for beyond 2024 for a team that is going to be without Kyle Bradish, at least for the start of next year. John Means is hitting free agency after this year and, of course, recovering from Tommy John. Tyler Wells is recovering from Tommy John. Corbin Burns is set to be a free agent. The Orioles need starting pitching for 2025 and hopefully 2026 in order to bolster this rotation for years to come. Jameson Taillon fits that bill. Now, the Orioles would have to absorb his contract, which under new owner David Rubenstein, we don't yet know if the Orioles are willing to do that, if they're willing to take on the kind of money that one of these guys might come with. That's a lot of money for the Orioles to be taking on. It's not the entirety of his $68 million deal, and perhaps the Cubs could toss in some money, but you're looking at about a 2.5-year, $42 million deal. That would be way beyond what the Orioles have spent in free agency on any pitcher, and certainly way beyond what the Orioles have taken back in salary in a trade. What they would be giving up in this proposed deal: Seth Johnson, a pitching prospect that the Orioles acquired 2 deadlines ago. He's the Orioles' number 9 prospect. He had Tommy John surgery right around the time that he was traded, so we haven't seen a whole lot of him so far, but he's putting up a good season so far for Double-A Bowie. They're slow playing him, not giving him as many innings as this is his first time really back on the mound. 2.66 ERA, but also a very high walk rate, 5.2 walks per 9 with Double-A Bowie. The thing is, he's holding a very important spot on this 40-man roster. And considering the fact that he's still in Double-A Bowie, that could be a spot that the Orioles could want to use on a big leaguer, but also on more prospects who are going to have to be added to the 40-man roster this winter in order to protect them from the Rule 5 draft. And if the Orioles don't feel like waiting for Seth Johnson to figure out his command issues, to get his walks under control, they might be willing to trade somebody like Seth Johnson, who also might not have the ceiling of a number 1, number 2, maybe not even a number 3 starter, probably a back end of the rotation starter anyway. That's really what you're getting in Jameson Taillon, a game 3 starter for a playoff series who is under team control for beyond 2024. I'm not positive the Orioles do this deal. In fact, I think it's unlikely because of the amount of money that they would have to be willing to take back, and also the concerns that Jameson Taillon could regress to his 2023 self. As good as his 2024 season has been, that 2023 season was awfully concerning. However, I think it's a deal that might be worth considering, and that's why I have that as my trade proposal on the BaltimoreBanner.com. All right, let's get to our featured guests. Let's start with Kyle Goon and his trade proposal as outlined on in that article. Now it's Kyle's turn to go through his trade proposal, make his pitch for this trade. And Kyle, you wrote about the Orioles acquiring a potential Angels left-handed starter. Tyler Anderson comes to Baltimore in your deal, and the Orioles send out second base prospect Connor Norby and outfielder Kyle Stowers. Pitch me on why you think this trade should happen.
Yeah, and should is kind of the underlying word here. I mean, I think we know how protective the Orioles are of their talent, and Connor Norby and Kyle Stowers are guys that they've protected for a very long time because they're right at the top of the prospect list. But realistically, all things aside, with however things shake out with Jorge Mateo, it doesn't seem like either of them are going to get a straightforward big league shot in the next season and a half, I'd say. And Jackson Holiday still is kind of sitting there, and at some point you figure he's going to take over Connor's spot. So I just, when you look at what the Orioles need, a lefty veteran starter, that's kind of what I was thinking there. And I know Tyler Anderson's a little older and he's not, missing as many bats, and he's delivering a little more walks than you like. But you look at his ERA, you look at, playing in front of a team that's just not so good. You kind of wonder what he can do with run support. I mean, he's leading the Angels in WAR, and just a 34-year-old who's been a couple playoff games, somebody who's kind of steady. I think the Orioles could really use someone like that to bolster the rotation, especially when you see how that the back half of the rotation is performing the last month or so.
Yeah, 2.91 ERA in 123 innings. So he's got a lot of innings already under his belt. Really a bounce back season for the 34-year-old after he had a pretty disastrous 2023. But he's looking more and more like the guy the Angels thought they'd get when they signed him to that contract. Norby, the Orioles' number 5 prospect, but only played 4 big league games when he came up in Toronto. And the Orioles, similar to where they were with Joey Ortiz before the season, just don't have room for him in this infield right now and in the future. And Kyle Stowers is the same way. He's been supplanted by Heston Kjerstad as a corner outfielder. There doesn't seem to be a path for him. He's 26 years old. He's not going to get a whole lot of more opportunities in Baltimore. So you're sending out 2 guys that probably don't have a long-term future in Baltimore, and you're getting somebody who is under team control for the end of this season and through 2025. I think this deal makes a lot of sense because especially that 2025 year, that's a reasonable $13 million. So you're not asking to pay a whole lot for a guy who's going to be under contract for another season.
And that's kind of the other thing. I mean, when the Orioles make a trade for pitching, what they really need is a trade for also 2025. And Tyler Anderson, maybe you get his best last good year at 35 years old next year, and that $13 million is a very manageable number. I think they only paid just a little more than that for Kyle Gibson, for example. So yeah, I just think it's a really a management of the next 2 seasons trade. And then something I think that just really isn't talked about is just the influence on the prospects in the system who just do not see a path forward, who don't see the light at the end of the tunnel for them in Baltimore. And I think, frankly, Connor Norby is one of those guys. I think it's kind of out there that Connor Norby is one of those guys who, understands they might be grinding for the next job in the next city. And Kyle Stowers is probably got to think he's one of those guys, given that he's behind, Colton Cowser and Heston Kjerstad, and just not really seen as much time as those 2 guys. So I just think it's a good move for, securing your pitching future for next year, but also just releasing some of the pressure on guys who, are in your system, but they know they are not going to end up Orioles long term.
Yeah, and I like that he's a lefty. So in a potential playoff rotation, you're throwing out 2 righties and Corbin Burns and Grayson Rodriguez, and then a lefty to kind of mix up the opponent's lineup. We saw how much that messed with the Orioles lineup when it came to the playoffs. So could be an interesting acquisition. Like you said, doesn't miss a whole lot of bats, but in the 100th percentile, according to StatCast, in off-speed run value. He's got an outstanding changeup, Orioles do well with lefties with good changeups, as we've seen with John Means. Kyle, I like it. I like it a lot. You've done a great job with this pitch. And next up is John Meoli. All right, so there's Kyle's pitch, having the Orioles acquiring Tyler Anderson from the LA Angels. John Meoli, his thinking was less lofty. Let's hear from John. John Meoli's trade proposal is a bit of a doozy. It involves the Orioles getting a reclamation project from the Miami Marlins in Trevor Rogers and sending out 3 prospects, Mac Horvath, Cameron Weston, and Tavian Josenberger. John, sell me on this trade because I need some convincing here.
All right, so I'm not going to, bury a month's worth of work and be like, actually, I think they're going to trade for, a top of the rotation starter. I'm going to stay consistent in my, approach to think that the Orioles are going to be a little more measured, do something to reinforce the floor of their rotation, but not necessarily go crazy. This is just a different kind of crazy. I think that the Orioles are the type of organization that can look at, somebody like Trevor Rogers, who was good a few years ago and has backed up a little bit, similar to what Jack Flaherty was last year, and say, we could probably do something with this. Taylor Swift, I can fix him. No, really, I can. Basically just their mantra where it comes to pitching at this point. The prospects I picked, Matt Horvath and Tavian Josenberger. On the hitting side, the Marlins really value bat-to-ball skills and guys who make a lot of contact. These guys do not swing and miss very often. There's also some power potential with Matt Horvath. I mean, when we talk about Orioles prospects, like there are like the no doubt big league guys, and there are also a lot of guys who are pretty good and on that track that just aren't there yet, that are on a little not slower, but like a more traditional developmental path. By this point in Colton Cowser or Connor Norby's minor league career, they were already like almost done with Bowie. And somebody like Matt Horvath is still in Aberdeen, and that's not a knock on him. They're just being a little more deliberate with these guys' development. So those 2 hitters fit the Marlins, desires. And Cam Weston's just a good pitcher. He doesn't overpower people with velocity. He's in the low 90s with his fastball, but he locates it really well at the top of the zone. He misses bats against lefties with his changeup. He has a really good slider that he uses to both sides. He's the type of pitcher who, if you went in to see Aberdeen when he was there or Bowie, you'd be like, this isn't this isn't like a wow, but like this is good. If you saw him pretty much any of his starts this year and you're a scout, you wrote him up pretty well. I don't think this is the type of deal that's going to make a lot of people happy if they did it, if the Orioles did it. But it's also the kind of deal that would not impact the farm system in any meaningful way. You still have all of the top prospects that you want to keep there. You're able to put faith in the pitchers you have internally. You're able to, get Trevor Rogers in the lab and get him working with Drew French and Mitch Plasmeyer and the pitching staff and try to optimize his stuff. And maybe the velocity comes back a little bit. The results start coming back a little bit. He's able to locate a little better with the stuff that he has. And you're talking about somebody that can help the Orioles for years down the road. Like I said, not super fun, not that, maybe a crazy trade in the sense that like, why would either side do this? But, I think that's more of the range that we're going to be working in than the high end of this market.
Things I like about Trevor Rogers, he is a left-handed pitcher. He has shown flashes in the past. He's a one-time All-Star, and he's under team control through 2026. Things I don't like about Trevor Rogers, he's got a 4.59 ERA. His StatCast page is bluer than the Atlantic Ocean, and there is really a whole big question mark as to whether you get him in here and he could start game 3 of a potential playoff series. I will push back on the idea that you could make a trade like this and it would be reminiscent of the Jack Flaherty move. Wouldn't the Orioles have learned their lesson from the Jack Flaherty trade?
Yes, and Jack Flaherty does not seem to have been a fit here in Baltimore, but you can't look at what he's doing now with the Tigers and say that there wasn't something there. It didn't happen here. Who's to say that he didn't just like file away everything he was told here in Baltimore and be like, well, I'm not really having a good time here, but I'll do this stuff eventually. And then he goes to the Tigers and does it, and like, boom, there you are. I think there's a lot of similarities to that. You don't want the Jack Flaherty outcome, but they traded 3 reasonably good prospects for Jack Flaherty, who had less control, who had maybe a little longer since he was actually really good.
It's been since like 2019 since he was good.
Yeah. Like Trevor Rogers was good in 2021. And I believe last year, he didn't pitch often. He only made like a handful of starts, but he's, there was a little more red on the StatCast page then. So I don't know. Like, I don't know if the Marlins are just like in the business of getting out of like from under like a pitcher who they have for the next few years anyways. I just think, I had put together trades for like Aaron Fetty in my head. I put together other kinds.
It's hard.
They're doable. I was trying to stay away from like the top guys, and I was trying to stay in a realm where I actually thought the Orioles would look and think they could get some value out of.
Yeah, it's a difficult game to try to play this. And as you mentioned in the article on the BaltimoreBanner.com, all fake trades are bad, and this is just a waste of time. So thank you for wasting your time.
Oh, I hate this. I'm smiling and I hate this.
I love talking to you, John, and that made my day. So
I mean, I like talking to you, but I hate doing this. It's just like I don't know. The For You page is the worst thing in the world that ever happened to the site formerly known as Twitter.com. Because I'm like, who are these people? And like, what are they talking about? That's just basically how I spend my life. And which is why I'm spending less of my life on that website now, which is, broadly good considering, there's like a very tiny human in my life that needs my attention.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate you taking time away from that tiny human to talk to us on the Banner Baseball Show. That is John Meoli's trade proposal. Let us know what you think. And next up is Danielle Allentuck. All right. If you were underwhelmed by John Meoli's trade proposal in which the Orioles acquire Trevor Rogers from the Miami Marlins, prepare to be blown away by Danielle's absolutely mega deal involving the Orioles and the Tigers. Well, if you were underwhelmed by John Meoli's trade, you thought he went too small potatoes, get ready for world record-sized potatoes, because Danielle Allentuck has proposed a trade that involves the Orioles getting Tarik Skubal, one of the best pitchers in baseball this season, and giving up their number 2 prospect, the number 12 prospect in all of baseball, the number 5 prospect, and 4 other players: Connor Norby, Samuel Basayo, Kyle Stowers, Dylan Beavers, Moises Chasse, and Edgar Portes. Head to Detroit. Danielle, the Orioles are selling the farm for Tarik Skubal.
Not the whole farm, just part of it. Like, don't go overboard here. But
okay. Just a pen or two.
My thought is the Orioles don't have an ace after this season. Corbin Burns probably not coming back to the Orioles. Let's be real here. Kyle Bradish out until midway through next year, more likely all of next year. Let's be realistic here. It's 12 to 18 months. Earliest he comes back is June, July. Grayson Rodriguez has the potential to be a number 1, but he's not quite there yet. I mean, maybe give him a year or 2 and then he's there. So I think you have to swing big and get a guy who can be your number 1 for years to come. And if Bradish and Rodriguez come back and they're fantastic and they become ace-like pitchers, then all the better. Then you have 3 aces. Nobody's ever going to complain about that. But Skubal's not a free agent until 2027. So you're getting a lot of control for this guy. So you have to give up a lot. And a lot of people don't think that the Orioles are going to give up one of their top 3 prospects. I think that's true about Holiday and Mayo. I think Basayo could go just because they have Adley Rutschman, and they can go get another cheap backup like James McCann and have that kind of be your fill-in guy when Adley needs a day off or just DHing for the day. So like of the 3 number 1 guys, he's the one that I see them trading. Connor Norby, we all know they don't really have a place for him here. Kyle Stowers, kind of same deal. So giving them away would hurt, but it would kind of be like, okay, they're not going to play for you anyways. It's kind of like the DL Hall, Joey Ortiz of last year. And then you kind of shift down to your next group of guys. You have Dylan Beavers. He's an outfielder. You have other great outfield prospects who are under team control for a long time. Hudson Kirkstead, Colton Cowser. Those guys will be your outfielders for years to come. And then, you have the last 2 guys, your pitchers, they're still pretty low, high A. They're just kind of like, to me, like the cheap add-ons. Like, they aren't going to push the deal over, but the Orioles aren't going to be upset about giving them away. It's just kind of like these 2 guys could pan out to be great pitchers one day. And if they do, great for Detroit. If not, it was just a tack on.
Yeah. It's bold. I will say that.
Mhm.
And it's a deal that reminds me of the deal that we saw the Padres make 2 years ago now with the Washington Nationals get Juan
Mhm.
Soto. I know Tarek Skubal, obviously different sides of the ball. He also doesn't have the same kind of track record that Juan Soto had. Juan Soto already won a World Series by this point. Tarek Skubal's never pitched in a postseason, but he is a young player who is controllable for potentially 3 postseasons and who is pitching like one of the best pitchers in all of baseball so far this year. A 2.34 ERA, whip under 1. This is a guy that is going to have a very, very high price tag. And if Orioles fans are balking at that kind of price tag, that's probably closer to what it's going to get. You know, we saw how much the Padres had to give up for Juan Soto, and it was Mackenzie Gore and James Wood and like 4 other players. So it could be a massive mega deal if the Orioles land him, but that also means he's less likely to be dealt because it would take such a haul, and we know how guarded Mike Elias is with his prospects. But of the Orioles' top 5-6 prospects, I think Basayo and Norby are the most likely to go because, like you said, Danielle, they have the most difficult path to big league playing time in the near future. And that's why they would end up on the outs. And same with Kyle Stowers, who has been replaced by Heston Kjerstad. This move would certainly get Birdland excited. It would check a number of boxes for this team in the short term and the long term. It would be a heck of a gamble by Mike Elias. It would be a not chips all the way in because you could still take out all those prospects and still have a very good farm system. But boy, you're pushing in a lot of assets to get somebody you think is going to be an ace for you in 2, maybe 3 postseasons.
And I also bring the point that I brought this up a lot. We still don't know what Rubenstein is going to do. We still don't know how much he's going to actually spend in free agency. But if they go out and get a pitcher at the trade deadline, you're going to be paying him a lot less than if you go out and get an ace, in free agency. So this is kind of a way, like, yes, prospects cost money, but you can replenish your farm system without spending the same kind of money you would have to go out to get an ace pitcher. So it could just kind of be another way around that.
Yeah. Danielle, I applaud your boldness, and I don't want to see your Twitter mentions after this, but I give you a lot of credit for making this kind of move because it's something that I think the Orioles could go for if they really get crazy at this deadline. All right. There are 4 trade proposals we think Mike Elias should consider, and I'm going to throw in a 5th and bonus trade proposal, and it has the Orioles acquiring right-handed pitcher Eric Fetty from the Chicago White Sox, the moribund Chicago White Sox, and giving up Enrique Bradfield Jr., first-round pick from a year ago, outfield prospect for the Orioles, third base prospect Max Wagner, and third baseman Ramon Urias. Now, Eric Fetty is one of the better pitchers on the trade market at this deadline. 2.89 ERA in 117 innings. Remember, he started his career with the Washington Nationals, had several up and down seasons, goes to Korea in 2023, totally changes his approach. He's on a 2-year, $15 million deal. In the first year of that deal, he's turned into an absolute steal for the White Sox and maybe one of the best free agent signings they've had in years. What you're giving up in this deal is Enrique Bradfield Jr., who is maybe the fastest prospect in all of baseball. He's got close to 50 steals already in high A Aberdeen this season. He's the Orioles' number 4 prospect, not a top 100, but could be. 281 batting average, 729 OPS. And you're giving up Max Wagner, who is kind of a throw-in in this deal. Orioles number 13 prospect, but has had a really rough start to his pro career. Probably going to drop in the midseason prospect rankings by MLB Pipeline. And Ramon Urias, who could be replaced by Kobe Mayo if the Orioles choose to add more pop to their lineup and deal one of their veterans. So that's another bold move the Orioles could get. If they want to get Eric Fetty, it would require, in my mind, Enrique Bradfield Jr., Max Wagner, and Ramon Urias. Finally, before I get out of here, I do want to say that part of that report that was mentioned earlier by Ken Rosenthal mentioned the fact that the Orioles would be open to reacquiring Jack Flaherty from the Detroit Tigers at this deadline. Now, Jack Flaherty, as you know, was traded for last deadline. Things did not work out. Was acquired to be a starter, started a few games, but ultimately was used as a reliever in the ALDS. Even when John Means was left off the ALDS roster, he wasn't even in consideration to start game 3 in Texas. Orioles start Dean Kramer. They get swept out in 3 games in the ALDS. It did not work out the last time the Orioles got Jack Flaherty. This is a different Jack Flaherty so far. 3.13 ERA for Detroit in 17 starts. He signed that 1-year deal with the Tigers. You'd have to be convinced that he has fixed whatever ailed him in the second half of the 2023 season. And you'd have to be convinced that he is ready to buy in to this Orioles team. The Orioles could pick up where they left off in terms of working and tweaking with his repertoire. They could pick up things that they learned about him in the first half of the 2024 season, but they also have a new pitching coach in Drew French. It's not just Chris Holt in there, director of pitching. So they'd have to be convinced that there is something there to work with and that he is willing and able to contribute to this Orioles team in the second half of 2024 and that he can start a playoff game, which he didn't do in the 2023 postseason. He wouldn't be my first choice. The other guys that were mentioned on this podcast, I would more likely go for if I were Mike Elias, because we saw how it went the first time. I don't think the Orioles are ruling anybody out. And I think that's the key language here is the Orioles are not ruling out Jack Flaherty. I don't think that they should rule anybody out, but I don't think the Orioles have Jack Flaherty at the top of their board because of how poorly things went in the second half of 2023. But I could be wrong. And if you liked what you heard from John Meoli and Danielle Allentuck and Kyle Goon and our trade proposals, you can hear more from them, from myself, from Andy Koska on our subscriber-only live event, noon on Tuesday, July 30th, the day of the trade deadline. The actual deadline itself is 6 o'clock Eastern. We will be live at noon for a subscriber-only event. We'll be taking comments, taking questions, going through all of the moves that are happening around Major League Baseball. Perhaps a move will already have been made that day. We know the Orioles have gotten deals done on deadline day early in the morning, like Jorge Lopez a few years ago. We could be breaking that down, and we could be breaking live news as the show goes on. So please do subscribe to the Baltimore Banner. $1 for 6 months, where you can read everybody's good work. You can tune into that subscriber-only live event. And of course, please do subscribe to the Banner Baseball Show. Give us a thumbs up, drop a like if you're watching live on YouTube, Twitter, or Facebook, and write us a good review. I will read it out here on the show if you write us a good review. Thanks so much to Danielle Allentuck and Kyle Goon and John Meoli for joining me. I'm Paul Mancano.